Hello everyone and welcome to our session on building strong vocabulary. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. In part 2 we're going to be talking about teaching context clues. On this session, I haven't uploaded the handouts yet for this one. I'll go ahead and send that out to anyone who is participating in our session at the end of the training. I'll send it to you via email. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Region 10 Online Learning Center as a resource within the next 2 weeks. And I think what I'm going to do is just kind of put it with our part 1 and just have it all in one location so you don't have to try to find each of the 3 parts. This information or this session is filled with some information, some good information about how to teach vocabulary. And if you wish to ask a question, please do so. However, questions are going to be answered at the end of today's webinar if time permits. Just a little information about myself. I am a Region 10 consultant. When I taught in the classroom, I did 4th, 5th, 6th grade, all self-contained. And I have 3 years instructional coaching experience and specialist experience. 2 years as a master teacher at the high school level. And this is actually going on my 3rd year as a Region 10 literacy consultant. So I just want to let you know again, this is a 3-part series. This one is part 2. Having gone into a lot of classrooms, I notice lots of different techniques for teaching vocabulary, but I want to make sure that I share with the teachers some strong research-based strategies. So in part 1 of our series, we talked about the research behind vocabulary development and instruction. We made sure that we understood the impact of vocabulary development, and we were able to define academic vocabulary at the 3 different levels. And then we made sure that we gave teachers some ways to understand how to select academic words to teach, and then how to introduce those words to students so that we build a love of vocabulary in our students. So for part 2, our goals are to understand the different types of context clues. And we want to gain some practical ways to teach the various types of context clues to students so that they use them to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. I'd like to go ahead and give people the resources that were used in the development of this series. The first resource is a book called Word Nerds. The next is a book called Vocabularians. And both of these books are available for viewing on stenhouse.com. So both of these books you can preview in their entirety on stenhouse.com. So don't have to go out and purchase them, although they would be great resources to have. The next set of resources, this one, another free one, but a great one, is part of the What Works Clearinghouse series on the IES practice guides from the U.S. Department of Education. And this one is teaching academic content and literacy to English learners in elementary and middle school. Again, this is another free resource that you can download for free. It has great resources in it that have been peer reviewed. So that means it'll give you kind of the effect size of the strategy. So sometimes we do things in our classrooms and we just aren't sure why they work. A lot of times if you look on this website and look in these IES practice guides, you'll be able to see why many of the strategies that you use work or why some don't. Because in these guides, they're going to give you the best strategies that are research-based, that are shown to improve student achievement. And that's ultimately what we want. The last resource that I use in the development of this series is Vocabulary is Comprehension. It gives a lot of different short reading text that you could use. A good resource, but that one's not free. So I always like to start any vocabulary session by asking this particular question. How many new words per year should our students learn? So if you're out there in the chat section or the question section, if you would type in, how many new words per year should students learn? I'm going to ask this question until I can't ask it anymore because it's that important, and folks need to make sure that their kids know so that they can also build that love of learning words in their kids. Their kids have to know how many words per year we're supposed to learn so that we become more conscious of words. So if you're out there, oops, what happened? There we go. I want to know how many new words every year should students learn? The answer is 2,000 to 5,000 new words per year. Actually, it's 2,000 to 3,000. But some research says as much as 5,000 of kids are behind in their vocabulary development. And I don't know about you, but when I was teaching, I often had a lot of kids who were behind in their vocabulary development. So 2,000 to 3,000 new words per year. And I know some of us, that seems like a big number, but keep in mind, we're not really learning that many new words. We're probably learning more like 1,000 roots or several hundred roots. And then from those roots, you're going to get, or bases, you're going to get a lot of different words. Okay. And once we tell that to kids, they're like, okay, so it is a reachable goal. You know, I can attain that. So in part 1, we talked about wide independent reading as a strategy for improving vocabulary. And strategy number 2 was direct teaching of academic vocabulary and other special types of vocabulary. In today's session, we're going to be looking at teaching context clues as the third research-based proven strategy to help students become better vocabularians. So our research tells us, and I won't share all the research from part 1, but the research tells us that students have a rich independent reading lives. So students who read more, students who read a bunch of diverse texts, they grow their vocabularies and build extensive background knowledge. Okay, so we know this. What we have to do is ensure that we are building word consciousness in our students. Okay. So word consciousness is not an isolated component of vocabulary instruction. It needs to be taken into account each and every day. What students need to understand and what you need to understand is that as a teacher, you can only explicitly teach about 400 or so words per year. So where are the kids going to get those other words from? From their reading. And so we've got to give them the tools to become more word conscious and to know what to do when they encounter those new words that they don't know. But first, students have to be conscious about words and understand the importance of learning words, become lovers of words, word nerds, if you will, so that they will want to pick up those new words that they encounter and not just kind of skip over them. So that brings us to today's strategy, which is teaching students how to use those context clues in order to build their vocabulary. Again, as a teacher, you can only explicitly teach about 400 of those words per year. So students are going to have to be word conscious and go and collect those other words for themselves. Teaching kids context clues gives them the tool to do just that. So how should we teach context clues to our students? Well, first, we've got to provide very clear explanations for the different types of context clues. We've got to give students strategies and models to look at, and then provide lots of opportunities for them to practice in partners and in pairs, in groups first, and then on their own. We've also got to teach students how to ask themselves questions so that they can better understand words and context. So some of those questions include things like, what is the overall intent of the text? So they actually have to look at the text and determine what's the intent or the purpose of this text. For example, is it about science or history? Because if you've looked in a science or history, social studies book and things like that, then you understand that a lot of those vocabulary words are, the context is given in the form of like appositive phrases that are immediately following the words. And a lot of times kids don't even recognize that. So we've got to teach kids how to use the syntax of the sentence to actually understand that a definition is coming, that the authors who write books and textbooks, they want the students to actually understand it. They're not trying to make it more complicated than it has to be. And so they give them lots of clues. And sometimes those clues come in the form of punctuation marks to let them know that here's the definition. Another question might be, is the text factual or a work of fiction? Okay, we know different vocabulary is used in factual text than in fiction text. In factual text, you might find a lot of tier 3 vocabulary, whereas in works of fiction, the words that you don't understand are probably going to be more tier 2 words, words that just highly illiterate people use. We want students to be able to analyze what is the genre of a text, and knowing that kind of goes back to what type of text it is, the factual or fiction. That's going to help them to understand what type of words maybe they're going to find and what kind of context clues are going to be there. In science books, you're going to find lots of examples. What are the words in the sentence or paragraph can provide with information? That's a very important one because that's very similar to how they are actually assessed. What are the words in the paragraph or sentence actually tell or help you understand what the word means? And then finally, what clues does the punctuation provide? Again, that goes back to the syntax, teaching kids how to identify context or definitions based on the punctuation that is provided. So now let's look at what do the state standards say about context clues. Folks, as early as first grade, kids are expected to determine what words mean from how they're used in a sentence. That's context, okay? In second grade, we start using the terminology context to determine the relevant meaning of unfamiliar words. And then that continues right on up to sixth grade to use context, okay? In seventh and eighth grade, use context to determine or clarify meaning of unfamiliar or ambiguous words. And then by the time they're in English 1 and English 2, they are analyzing textual context to distinguish the denotative and connotative meanings of words. And finally, in English 4, not 5, just English 4, and they're analyzing textual context to draw conclusions about the nuances in word meanings. So sometimes I've seen teachers teaching students about context clues, and they say, well, just look at the sentence that it's in when a student asks them or tells them that they don't understand a word. The teacher says, well, look at the word, look at the sentence that it's in. And interestingly, research studies have shown that context clue strategies usually the text doesn't provide enough context in just the sentence that the word is contained in. So actually, context in itself, just by itself, is an unreliable source of information if you're defining context simply as the sentence in which we find the unknown word. A lot of times students have to read an entire paragraph before they can go back and understand and find the context clue that actually helps them to determine what a word means. So there's seldom enough information in a single sentence to help students actually figure out the word. The context appears to be only helpful in those cases if you already know the meaning of the words. So we've got to make sure that we're not defining context as just the sentence that the word is in. And then sometimes I've heard teachers even go a little step further and say the sentence before it, the sentence is in, and the sentence after it. That's a little bit better, but the truth is, again, sometimes students have to read a whole paragraph or the whole essay in order to really determine what a word means. And so teaching students how to identify the different types of context will help us in that feat. So what I'm going to do now is kind of walk you through some possible objectives when you get ready to teach context clues in your classroom. And today I'm going to look at like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, kind of taking those middle grades. So here's the TEKS for 6th grade and using context clues. So an objective that I might use as a teacher might be students will use the different types of context clues found in sentences in order to determine the meaning of unknown words. And then that student demonstration of learning, Students will show an understanding of new words by writing original sentences in which they provide context clues for the words' meanings. So the way I'm going to show, or the way kids are going to show me their learning is that they're going to write their own original sentences in which they can provide the context clues. So once I have students able to create their own sentences showing context, then that's really going to help them when it's time to read a piece of text on an assessment and pick out the correct context. I want you to take a look at this little example of a story for me, and I want you to read this short text. So it says, "Dear Diary, I overslept this morning. I had to eat my bowl of poof poofs very quickly, and I almost missed the tram zam. When I got to school, I realized I had forgotten my zilping. Luckily, Mrs. Jutsu is very zoosh and told me I could bring it tomorrow. After school, some friends and I played a plingming. It's a new game I'm learning. We scored 7 points and they only scored 5 points. So we were the Zoiders. Dad says that next weekend we're going to the Flatter. I can't wait. I love to swim and play in the sand. I hope I don't get a sunburn though. Well, I better go to bed soon. I don't want to wake up late again and miss my tram zam." So looking at this text that has a bunch of nonsense words, I want you to read over it again and try to figure out what each of these words mean. So go ahead and, if you will, take a moment and kind of jot down these words and see if you can determine what they actually mean. I'm going to go ahead and give you about 60 seconds to do that. All right, so if you would, in the chat section, I know we're not finished with the question section, would you go ahead and start typing in what you think some of these words mean? So, for example, poof poof, tram zam, zilk ping. What do those words mean? So if you would type those in for me. Any takers? All right, so I'm not seeing any responses, so I'm not sure if anyone is actually typing in. Let me see if we got a question there. Oh, thank you. Cicely says that poof poofs must mean cereal and tramzams probably means bus. Any other takers out there? Pamela, let's see, you got a question. Not seeing. I seem to be having some trouble seeing some of the responses that you're typing in. That sometimes happens when we're on a webinar. But we'll go ahead and move on to the next steps there. This is actually an activity that you can use with your kids. So once they read that little short nonsense type article, you have them kind of share their answers. What could the word poof poofs mean? And we kind of walk them through. The sentence tells me it's something that can be eaten. And I know that it is a breakfast food because Ryan said it was morning. I also know that it goes in a bowl. So what do you think it is? Of course, in the morning, it would make sense that it would be some cereal or oatmeal or something like that. So the most logical guess would actually be a type of cereal. So what could the word tramzam mean? I think we also, the sentence tells me that Ryan was going to school and he almost missed the tramzam. So, you know, if you're missing something in the morning, that's probably going to be a bus. Let's look at zilgping. Let's see. The sentence tells me that it's something Ryan needed at school. I also know that it is okay if he brings it tomorrow. So I think it's probably going to be homework. And then what could the word Zoosh mean? Let's see. The sentence tells me that a person can act this way, and that Mrs. Jutzi is being kind and allowing Ryan to bring his homework the next day. So Zoosh, the most logical guess would be friendly or kind, so the teacher's being nice or she's being understanding in letting him bring in his homework the next day. Let's try, what about the Plingming? Well, the sentence tells me it's a game and his friends played against each other and that points can be scored. So maybe it's a sport like soccer or basketball. And as far as Zoiders, the sentence tells us that Ryan and his team scored 7 points while the other team scored less points. So then Ryan's team must have been the winners. Last one, flatter. And since the sentence tells me that Ryan's dad said he could go there when he gets there, they're going to swim and play in the sand, and he mentions that he doesn't want to get sunburned, then the most logical guess for a flatter is a beach. Now, again, this is an activity you can actually use with your students so they can see how did we actually figure out the meaning of all those crazy words. And what we actually did was use the context clues. So this is a great way to introduce to our students about context clues. In our session today, we're going to look at these particular types of context clues. Now, what you will find is that other sites, research may give you different names for the different types of context. There are other labels out there, so I just want you to know that. This is the one that I tend to use. It just seems pretty simple for the kids to understand. So these are the 5 that I typically use. They're not the only ones. There are others out there, but these are the ones that I like to teach. It's just kind of a nice little package there. So definition, synonym, anonym, example, and then general. So when we talk to kids about context, we want to make sure that they understand why they're learning context or why they're ever learning anything that we teach them in class. So one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we tell them why. Okay. First of all, it's going to save them time when they're reading. They're not going to have to stop and try to look up every single word in the dictionary. A lot of times I've heard teachers tell kids that student says, well, I don't know this word. And the teacher says, well, what do we do when we don't know a word? As if this is the only thing to do. And then the kid says, look it up in a dictionary. The truth is that is not the first move for most good readers. Good readers look at the context. They look at the word parts. Does it have any suffixes or prefixes, any type of, roots that I can identify that'll help me understand what it means? And if all else fails, then they'll look at the dictionary. Okay? And we know that usually takes our students quite a bit of time to look words up in a dictionary. So we don't just jump to the dictionary first. After you figure out the meaning of some of the same word more than once through its context, it's going to become part of your working vocabulary, and therefore you will add it to your 5,000 words. Okay. Also, a reason we can tell kids for learning context is going to give you a good sense of how a word is actually used, including any multiple meanings it might have. So we want to give kids reasons why we should learn how to use the context. So let's take a look at another grade level's objectives for 7th grade. Again, here's the SE, and the student's objective might look more like this. The student will use different types of context clues found in sentences in order to determine the meaning of unknown words. And again, students will show their understanding by writing original sentences. So if you notice here, here's for 8th grade, you can use a lot of the same objectives. So now we want to talk to our students about what are context clues. We just said we use the context clues to figure out those nonsense words. And so what are they? So they're the words surrounding an unfamiliar word that provide clues to the word's meaning. And why is it important to be able to use those? We just kind of told kids why it's important to be able to use those. It's really going to help them with their reading. It's going to help them understand words better, to understand the text better. It's going to save them a lot of time from not having to look up words in the dictionary. So the first type of context clue we wanted to talk about today was the definition context clue. So sometimes the definition of a word is embedded right there in the text. And often the definition will be set off by a comma or a couple of commas. So if you look at the example on the screen here, the factory supervisor demanded an inspection, comma, a careful and critical examination of all the meats processed each day. This is probably the most easy context clue to teach, and it's just about making kids aware. How many times have you had kids read a social studies or a science book and the definition came immediately after the word, but you ask a student what the word means and they couldn't tell you? It's because they just hadn't been made aware of that type of context clue, which is a definition that is usually immediately followed in certain types of text, like your science book, like your social studies books, and your math books. They often use those types of context clues. But every now and then, in your regular reading of fiction is also included in there. So students just have to be made aware so that they can just kind of perk up whenever they see these different. They need to become word conscious. They need to become context clue conscious. So another example of a definition, the explorers landed in an alien environment, a place both foreign and strange to their beloved homeland. So then based on that statement, what's the definition of alien as it is used in this sentence? That's very similar to how they will be asked to identify uncommon words on their EOCs and STAR assessments. Take a look at the second one. There are many theories or ideas about what made the ice ages happen. So then, what's the definition of the word theories as it is used in this sentence? So after today, I'm actually going to send you a link to this presentation. Again, you could actually use this as part of your lesson to your kids. Now, with my students, am I going to teach them all 5 of these types of context clues in one day? Absolutely not. Probably not. You're not going to have time for that. So I would choose 2 to introduce at a time, or maybe 3, and then the next day do the other 2. The next type of context clue we have here are examples. Sometimes the authors just give the students examples of the concept. So here's a little cartoon. You told me to use my initiative if I needed money, so I sold your car. So initiative. So she kind of took it into her own hands, basically. So examples are often introduced with signal words. So we have to teach kids how to identify these signal words, like for example, for instance, including, and such as, and teach kids to become more conscious that when they see those words, that the author is giving them clues following. So the author is telling them some clues. So for example, look at nocturnal. Nocturnal creatures, such as bats and owls, have highly developed senses that enable them to function in the dark. So based on that sentence and the keywords or the clue words, signal words such as, then a nocturnal creature is an animal like a bat or an owl, and they only come out at night. So in this case, nocturnal means, and this is an example of how I could get kids involved in responding. They could have ABC cards, and then when I count to 3, they could show me what the word nocturnal must mean. And we would hopefully know that it's not feathery, because a bat isn't feathery, although an owl is. Yes, they're both living, but you don't have to be living just to have highly developed senses. Another example would be the word mundane. And you would go through that same process here to get students to choose the correct definition. And then another example here with the word mishap. I could also here talk about the word parts, the prefix miss, and what it usually means, not. Again, a little bit more practice. And then on to the next type of context clue, which would be synonyms. Now, in a class, I think that the first two types would be more than enough for one day. And then I would give the students an opportunity to practice in partners, writing their own sentences containing those two types of context clues. I could provide them with a list of words, or I could allow them to use a short piece of text and then take those words that are in that text and maybe write context clues for the two types that we had just studied. Okay, but let's move on and look at synonyms. Take a look at the cartoon. My doctor said smoking could terminate my life, but I told him everybody's life has to end sometime. So terminate here, the synonym would be end. So synonyms are words that mean the same or almost the same as the unknown word. And a synonym can appear anywhere in a passage to provide the same meaning as the unknown word. So let's go back to the mundane definition. It says, doing mundane activities help me relax. I like the calmness that performing ordinary tasks makes me feel. So in this case, ordinary is a synonym for mundane. And then, of course, we would give students more examples and have them identify the words or the synonyms for those new words. And again, notice how I'm focusing on my tier 2 words. These are words that just highly literate people would use, words that we want to see in kids writing and in their speaking in class. Next, we move on to antonyms, the opposite of synonyms. So I would probably teach, you could teach antonyms and synonyms on the same day if you've covered both of those concepts. I would say anywhere from 4th grade on up, you could do that. It's a special hearing aid. It lowers criticism and amplifies compliments. So antonyms are words that mean the opposite of another word. They're also a useful context clues. Antonyms are often signaled by words and phrases such as however, but, yet, and on the other hand. So this is some great information that you could include on an anchor chart in the classroom. So I might have these different types of definitions on an anchor chart in the classroom with some examples so that my kids could refer to it as much as they need to. So here's the example: trying to control everything your children do can impede their growth. To advance their development. So instead of impeding, the opposite would be advance. So the opposite of advancing would be to stop, to halt, to block it. Again, because I have these ABCD choices here for you on this particular like lesson and examples, you could easily have the kids hold up the cards, write on whiteboards, but we want to get all the kids active in actually trying to figure out these different types. And this is just to introduce the different types of context clues. This is not the true practice, okay, and application. This is just when you're introducing the different types of them. You could have students make a context clue foldable or a context clue book and maybe introduce one type of context clue a day over a week period. So here's another anonym. Many politicians do not give succinct answers. That's a funny one if you listened to the debates last night. They prefer long ones that help them avoid the point. So the opposite of succinct would be long. So succinct must be very short and precise. If politicians prefer to give long answers, then what kind of answer do they usually not give, that would be a short one. Okay, and so again, you have the ABCD choices here. So if you're using this with your kiddos, you could absolutely have them do some multiple student responses, and everybody has to respond. You can use your clickers. You could put this in Kahoot if you wanted to, but I'm trying to give you something that you can go back and instantly use in your classroom with your kiddos. Again, you do not teach all of these different types of context clues in one day. It could make sense to put the synonym and antonym together, but if you haven't introduced both of those concepts, then you need to do it introduce them one at a time. And this just gives you another example. Now, the final one are general types of context clues. This one says, I like a prescription that will alleviate my aches and pains and also make me younger and thinner. So when we talk about general, it's basically giving lots of different examples here. So a former employee, irate over having been fired, broke into the plant and deliberately wrecked several machines. So if you're irate, you might do something like breaking into a plant and wrecking the machines. Okay, so an irate person is someone who's very mad, and it makes sense you would be mad from being fired, right? So what would the employee's state of mind be? Irate means what? Relieved, very angry, or undecided. So in general, they're kind of giving you a lot of different clues to what the word might actually mean. Here's another example with proximity. Despite the proximity of Ron's house to his sister's house, he rarely sees her. So even though the proximity of his house to her house is close, he rarely sees her, because it wouldn't be rare if someone lived far away from you for you not to see them very often. Okay, so again, having students practice. I could see this being maybe 5 days worth of little mini lessons, but this part here is just the teach piece and the guided. I can show you in a little bit how you could actually extend these activities with students working in partners. So one of the things that you could do when we talk about partner work is after you've introduced certain types of, or all the different types, or maybe even one or two of context clues, you can have students do some partner reading. You could display a short text containing several grade level words and sufficient context clues, and then have the students work with partners to read the selection and identify words that they don't know. You then want to invite students to come up to the whiteboard, or you can have them actually highlight on their own copy of the text any unfamiliar words and anything that they consider to be the surrounding context clues. You could have them identify the different types of context clues that are contained in the text. You then want to have the students share their thinking and discuss. And to confirm their thinking, you can have students search for the words in their dictionaries and other resources. So here's where I could have kids actually looking up words in the dictionary, but only after they've gone through the thinking process and done what good readers do, which is to kind of use your context, use other parts of the word first. Now I can have students search it in a dictionary to actually confirm their own thinking. And that's what you want, not just always going to the dictionary just because you have one there. Because oftentimes the dictionary definition, we know, is so advanced that you have to look up all the words in the definition. And that's what we don't want. A second activity that I can have students do is, once they've gained a little bit more proficiency in identifying the different types of context clues, or even after each day when I introduce a type of context clue, I can then have students go on a scavenger hunt for just that type of context clue. Or eventually I can put this type of form over in a center in the classroom, and that can be a station where students look for new words. Or it can be an assignment where students, in their own independent reading, they have to identify new words that they've learned and what type of context clues they use to learn those new words. So the whole idea here is to make kids more word conscious, and in this case, more context clue conscious. Another activity that I could have my students do, and again, I will give you a link to copies of all of these materials. And these are just forms that I made myself, depending on the grade level that I was teaching at the time. So in this one, we can combine dictionary skills, again, with context clues sentences, where the students actually have to write sentences that will show their understanding of a word, because they'll be able to use the different types of context. And what I do on these types of sheets is I make sure that students understand you can't use the definition context clue for all three of your sentences. You have to have three different types of context clues in your sentences to help people understand the new words. Okay, this could also be in a station. You see here where I have kind of a routine what the kids would do. So they would use an electronic dictionary to check the pronunciation of any words from the selection that they don't know how to pronounce. They're going to practice saying the word with a partner. And then record the syllabication, part of speech, and simple definition. That's also in their essays. Then they would write context sentences for three of the words that they wish to add to their fabulous 5,000 in their vocabulary journals. But you want to make vocabulary instruction a big part of what you do. You want to set it up so that kids become, like I say, lovers of words, and that they are self-directed and self-guided in their hunt for new words to add to their own vocabulary. So those are just some of the other activities that I could do as my guided practice before I actually turn kids loose to do it independently. So any of those three activities could be done in partner work, in group work first, before having kids do it independently. And then by mid-year, you could give your students each child one of these forms independently, and they would be able to do this on their own. Again, I want to go ahead and just kind of reiterate the resources that were used in the making of this particular session. Don't forget the IES practice guides. We have some time for some questions, although I'm having difficulty seeing those questions. You'll also get some more of these resources here that we use to make some of the activities, or where I got some of the activities in this. In the first webinar series, I challenged the participants to take one of the activities that we showcased in that PowerPoint and that presentation and use it with their own students. So in this one, I'm going to kind of do the same. I want to challenge you to teach your kids the different types of context. You will have a copy of the presentation, the real presentation, not a PDF. So you'll have a copy of the presentation so that you could use those slides with your students. And I would love it if you would then maybe take pictures of your kids using your multiple responses as they answer and work through those questions. You will get a handout of all of the forms that were used in this session. So at this point, although it's looking like it's not easy, or I'm not being able to see your questions really, because I'm clicking on it and nothing's happening. You might have to try your question in a chat section, if there's a chat section, if you have any questions. This does happen sometimes, so that's unfortunate. I don't know, maybe I'll be able to see the questions once we look at attendance. And if that's the case, if I can see the questions, sometimes they show up on the attendance form. What I'll do is I'll send you a personal email, and I do apologize for that. That does happen sometime here. But since I'm not able to see any other questions right now, we'll go ahead and wrap up let me see here. Let me check one more. Okay, here we go. All right, so here we go. I do have a question. It says, do you have any suggestions for how to adapt the activities for first grade? So with this particular session, I do think I said that these webinars here, I'm not sure if I said they were K-12 or 312 for this particular part here. But if I were going to adapt for first graders, here's what I do know. A lot of times the only difference is I would need to read aloud sometimes the text to my students. But again, first graders just need to be able to identify words based on the sentence that it's used. So as a teacher, the first grade teacher, you're doing plenty of read alouds. So therefore, just whenever you're reading and you want kids to learn a new word, make sure you read and you find one that has a good context clue right there in the sentence, because that's what their SC says. Then I would make sure just to emphasize those words to my students. But like I say, a lot of times for the first graders, it's just that as the teacher, you're doing the reading, whereas for the older kiddos, they would be much more involved in their own reading. But for first grader in this particular activity with teaching context clues, I wouldn't think a first grader needs to know all of these different types of context clues yet, because their SE just says to be able to identify it in the sentence. So I would just focus on that for this particular part. Okay, are there any other questions? I did see where I can go and kind of look at some of the questions all at once. It's just not popping up one by one. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, let's see here. I think I can give you my contact information. Here's my contact information. If you have any other questions, please let me know. Again, it'll take a day or so to get the attendance. So if you are very eager and want to use the slides right away, you can just send me a direct email and say you need the slides from today's webinar vocabulary part 2. But please make sure you say part 2, because today has been a very busy day. So if you would, please send me an email and put that in the subject area that you want part 2 slides and handouts. Otherwise, we'll have to wait till I get the attendance, and sometimes that takes a couple of days. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you got some information that you can use. There is research to support using or teaching the context clues, and that comes straight from the IES practice guides, and it's one of those things that in the research for this particular session that I found over and over and over again. Teaching kids how to identify context clues helps them to develop their vocabulary. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you for part 3 in November.